Muy buenos días.
Good morning. On behalf of the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB, we give you a warm welcome to our webinar, Funding for Women's-Led MSMEs. I am Karina Assad. I am a consultant in the connectivity markets and financial division of the IDB, and I will be your master of ceremonies and host for this.
Welcome. My name is Karina Azar, and I'm part of the Connectivity Markets and Finance Division at the IDB, where I oversee the gender and diversity mainstreaming agenda in the financial sector. And I will be your host for this webinar. Let me start with some housekeeping messages. Primero, tendremos interpretación simultánea. En la parte inferior de su pantalla encontrará un icono de un globo terráqueo y al hacer
First, you have simultaneous interpretation. Just go down to the globe icon on the lower right-hand corner. So we will have the webinar will be in Spanish, but we will have interpretation into English. So we will allow for a couple of minutes so that you can connect to your language of preference.
Clicking the globe icon. The webinar will be held in Spanish with English translation, and I will give you a couple of seconds so you can adjust your language preferences. Segundo, los invito a que participen en el chat haciendo preguntas y comentarios.
We also invite you to participate with questions and comments via the chat. So just go down to the lower left-hand corner. You can use chat, Q&A, and we will also include in the chat information considered relevant for the content of this presentation. During the event, we invite you to also follow us in our Twitter account, and we also, which is at ELIDB. Also working in this webinar hosted by the Division of Connectivity Markets and Financial Sectors, we're going to be looking at MSMEs headed by women. We will also look at the best practices that can be replicated by national development banks. So once again, thank you very much. And we will now begin with Juan Ketterer, who will offer a few words of welcome. Go ahead, Juan Antonio Ketterer, Chief of Division of Connectivity Markets and Finance at the IDB. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us this morning and sharing with us in this workshop, which is very important for the connectivity markets and finance sector here at the IDB with their vision. We are fully committed with the gender equity agenda, and in particular, the topic we're going to be looking at today. We start off with a situation in Latin America and the Caribbean that is fairly unique to a certain extent. Today, we see an extraordinarily wide gap in terms of financing on the order of about $93 billion in the specific segment of women-led MSMEs. And this is particularly serious because of the gap. It exceeds the gap that the business sectors headed by men. In an attempt to try to address the gap, the bank attempts to understand or get a better understanding of the circumstances that lie behind this gap. We have a real challenge that has to do with disaggregated data. Without having very clear, well-defined data that are reliable and accurate, it's very difficult to implement viable solutions. However, these perceptions, as we indicated earlier, are crucial, and we continue strengthening efforts in that direction. So today, our keynote speaker, Mayra Oynik, is going to focus specifically on this topic. We're also going to have Karina Schneider and Gabriel Andrade, who are going to be looking at some of these key issues. Then we have Karina Araujo, who is actually heads the diversity, gender diversity division at the bank, who's going to be addressing this as well. I think this dialogue process has yielded very positive results. And mainly, we are conveying the message that at the IDB, and in particular in our division, we are fully committed and keenly interested in the program content. And we, of course, can't do this alone. We need the support of many, not financial support, but in this specific case, we need ideas, know-how, concepts that and data sources that perhaps we have not lost sight of. So we continue to rely on your support. And again, thank you for joining us. And without further ado, I will yield the floor back to Karina. Thank you very much and have a very fruitful and enjoyable discussion. Well, thank you very much, Juan, for those very pertinent comments, especially in addressing the major gap in regards to financing women's-led MSMEs. So now let's offer the floor to Mayra Bubinic, our keynote speaker. She's a senior fellow at Data 2X. Previously, Mayra was director at Gender Diversity at the IDB. She also led the social development sector, also chair of the women's developmental programs. She has a degree from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Mayra. Go ahead. Well, thank you very much for these words of introduction. It is a pleasure to be able to share this in this discussion with you today. Juan Antonio, thank you very much for those very encouraging words of introduction. We're very pleased to see how the bank has made efforts to bridge that gap in terms of gender financing. So I'm going to begin with my presentation, Karina. If we can have that, put it up on presentation mode. Before I start talking about data, let's move on to the second slide. We asked the question, why is it so important to serve the needs of women's-led MSMEs? There are actually four reasons, but let me start off with this. The first reason is the returns on investment with women's-led business really exceed the average. Businesses led by women actually invest less, but generate greater profits. And we can see, according to these studies, the yields are very high in exchange for very low investments. Secondly, the financial performance levels is better. When, according to data from Chile, this is an IDB report prepared by Ana Maria Montoya, actually shows better levels of repayment when it has to do with women's-led businesses. The third reason is the investments in family. When women are given income, they tend to invest more of their income in their families. This is a study that was conducted in Indonesia, and this, by the way, was just recently published. These are the effects of the impact of access to training as well as savings. This is with regards to women's-led businesses. As you can see here, we follow the income and family well-being patterns over a 24-month period. There are two things that really stand out in this study. First of all, the increase in the income levels through these interventions may take a little longer in actually happening. And this is actually the result of several studies, including one in Peru, where we see the same patterns. So the experimental design when it's conducted, it's not just a question of looking at the data immediately, but actually you need to follow the pattern over an extended period of time, because you actually see the income appear after some time. But as you can see on the data, the family well-being levels increase significantly. And we research the mechanisms, the tools that lead to this. Women invest part of their income in capital devoted to the business, and part of it is devoted to family well-being. So this is another factor that I think is very important, and one of the reasons why we should invest in more financial services for businesses led by women. In other words, to rectify some of the negative impacts resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a World Bank study, and it states that women-led businesses tended to shut down more frequently during the pandemic than businesses led by men. In fact, the average was 5.9 percentage points greater. And in Latin America, it was even more dramatic. 10% more businesses shut down that were led by women during the pandemic. So now, when we look at the reasons, what happens when women's led MSMEs have restricted access to financial services? We have a case study here of Rosa in Tanzania. And if we look at Rosa in Tanzania, she's a widow, and she has a fairly common type of business you find in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia. She sells food products, and she also sells beer. Rosa had a stand at an open market, but she was able to grow her business. She had this stand that was outside, and she was able to, with the help of her savings, was able to set up business inside a market. So we asked, how was she able to save these resources? And so she said, just wait a minute, I'll take you home in a while. So she had in she had several keys on a keychain. So she opened the door of her house, and we went into her living room. And then she opened up and actually she brought this box, and she showed us the money that she had saved. And this is because she had not been able to get any access to financial services. So whatever profits she made, she would put in that glass jar. She would put the day's profit, actually half of the day's profits would be reinvested in the business. The other half she would put in this, what you see is a bag there. And that money that she saved and accumulated over several years, she finally saved up to buy a car. She needed a car. And then finally, you see her safety deposit, where her box on the right, that's where she had her emergency money. So Rosa was able to save, but she did it in a very inefficient way, and also a very dangerous way. So the financial services for women, which women who save, these services are of crucial importance to them. Women have unique preferences and restrictions vis-a-vis financial services. This is a meta-analysis study that was conducted. There are 13 experimental studies where people were provided basic savings financial services. And women, compared to men, tended to use the savings accounts much more frequently than men. Women prefer overall to save. but they also have unique restrictions in the financial sector. And in particular, they face unique discrimination. Restrictions from the demand side are well known. Differences in financial education and support, but the supply side restrictions that are less familiar are as important, or maybe even more important: discrimination with regards to financial services, lack of access to financial services, and having interest rates for their savings. All of these are very serious obstacles and impede service providing for women. So let's take a look at the role of gender data in the context of financial inclusion. What can data, how can they be used in order to include women in the financial services sector? On the one hand, we have demand side data. There we can see preferences and needs stated by women. For example, women would rather save more than men, as well as the scope of these financial services. What is the real gap between men and women in terms of access to financial services? And we have the supply side data, which is also very important. And they're more difficult to obtain. And basically give us a clear glimpse as to who and how customers are receiving benefits. When we look at the supply side data, we can see clearly the scope and the extent of the discrimination suffered. These are data that are fairly familiar, and these are supply side data. Chile, for example, was the first country in the region and in the world, actually, that asked all of the banks to provide to the bank superintendency disaggregated data by sex dating back to 2002. Now they have a whole time series, and this was in 2015, but they continue to compile the data. This data is very important, as you can see here, and they show that women would prefer to save. Individual savings accounts show that women, first of all, they have more savings accounts than men on average, and all of the data showed the Chilean government and the banking sector as well, that ultimately women had less access to loans and financial services. However, they were women-led businesses were generating greater interest, whereas women's businesses were getting better returns. Here's another study, a study that we conducted with Gabi Andrade at the IDB. This is a study that was done in cooperation with Data 2X and the IDB. The information shows exactly what the supply side data gives us a glimpse of. Women, in fact, in Mexico had surpassed men in terms of the number of bank accounts. But just looking at the supply side, we could glimpse to see exactly what was going on in the financial sector. The National Development Bank, most of the clients of National Development Banks were women. In commercial banks, the situation was a little different. We could see that there was some difference that favored the men in terms of the commercial banks. So if you want to look at the behavior patterns of financial services, it's crucial that you have supply side data. Given the importance of the supply side data, in particular, in addition to the demand side data, to get a better understanding of the behavior patterns of women's financial services and to get a better understanding about their needs for financial services, there was some cooperation, and actually this is called WIFID partnership. The IDB is a part of that, and Data 2X also is coordinating efforts. We conducted a study covering 6 countries in order to determine exactly how the financial system, how is it uh, using disaggregated data by sex in the 6 countries, which includes, well, Nigeria, Honduras, Kenya, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Turkey. We saw some interesting patterns. The first thing we did was with a reference framework, we were able to actually just see how close the banks and the financial regulators were in being aware of the significance of providing women-led businesses with the financial services. And in the vertical axis here, the quality data, those stars that you see in the chart, those represent the financial regulators, and the X's are the individual banks that we interviewed. In summary, what we saw with the study that that stood out was that just about every country, with the exception of Honduras here, but just about all of the countries have more data, so demand side data of the financial services than supply side financial data. Nevertheless, there are also some supply side data. The real issue between the demand side and the supply side data is that a lot of the information is not used, even if it's available. The financial regulators nor the banks use the data in order to make financial decisions. Then the second factor that stood out here had to do with the need to have both financial services supply and demand data. In the case of Mexico, we realized that if you don't have the financial services demand side data, you may have the impression that there's really no issue in terms of discrimination or lack of access to commercial financial services, even though they do exist. What we can see in the case of Mexico is that the national development banks are the ones that address women more than men. So thirdly, the financial regulators and the banks have different data needs. And this perhaps is one of the reasons why financial services, banks don't use the data that financial regulators require. Financial regulators are interested in questions regarding access to financial services to see what percentage of the population ultimately gets access to financial services. The banks are, on the other hand, not as interested in that. They're much more interested in the financial behavior pattern. So that's why it's important for financial regulators who are really in the forefront in asking for disaggregated data broken down by sex, and that ask banks that they examine closely the financial patterns of behavior patterns broken down by sex, because that's where we'll be able to have or design more effective programs for women. Another challenge relating to the data, which is a common challenge to all the countries, and that has to do with being able to accurately measure the micro, small, medium enterprises headed by women. There are different operational criteria, definitions. Everybody's using a different sets of criteria, and they don't seem to be able to harmonize these definitions. And finally, the study also showed and highlighted the fundamental importance of the financial regulators and national development banks' role, because they're really in the forefront in terms of raising an awareness about the importance of the benefits that women need to receive, and that can lead the financial sector that will provide improved services for both men and women. You also need to have champions in the financial sector that can address the needs and speak on behalf of women's financial services. At the same time, we need to provide. The banks don't use data because the data have not been digitized. People still write down a lot of the data on pencil and paper, with pencil and paper. Also, you need to document the uh, the reasons why women need to be incorporated into the financial services sector. This is basically a vicious circle because it's the data that provide the proof and establishes the reasons why women need to be in the financial services. But if you don't have that, those data, that's a vicious circle and a catch 22. So the role of national development banks is extraordinarily important. And in order to mobilize the financial services systems, you need to have accurate data, both on the demand and supply side, that have to be disaggregated by sex. Thank you very much, Maida, for those. I think this just fits perfectly to what we're looking at, the financial services access, barriers to access, the key role of the banks and the financial regulators. So I think that clearly touches and is actually dovetails into what we were discussing in the reports. Again, you're welcome to post your questions on the chat or Q&A. I now offer the floor to Cristina Lopez Mayer. And just to establish the proper context, a few years ago, we've been working with at the IDB with other development banks supporting women-led MSMEs. And in this, we're going to actually be providing, both of us, Cristina and myself, some perspective. But before I begin, let's introduce the presentation and offer some context regarding the specific publications. Let's move on to the next slide. And this is the basically highlights the role of national development banks in funding women's-led MSMEs, the actions that they play as executing agencies in women's business financing. The financing programs is focused also on breaking down many of the bottlenecks that have impeded access to women's businesses to financial services. So this is one additional aspect that has to do with the DNA of these institutions. Another element that I think is at the center of this discussion is that development banks really have that role of driving the rest of the financial ecosystem. We can see on the screen in the lower part that it really starts off that cascade effect, and it basically supports the roles of development banks, financial intermediaries. They need to energize this through available resources in order to whet the appetite with regards to financial intermediaries, to encourage them to provide financial services to women's-led businesses. This is a follow-up that, and it's important that the development banks become these engines of also spreading know-how and information. We're looking at development banks also as mentors. How can they be more effective in leading these financial services in various segments and geographic areas where you see greater gaps that are detrimental to women's, the small, medium, micro, medium, and small businesses, and looking at the cross-referencing this with specific sectors and studies that have to do also with gender biases. So these are the various components within the ecosystem. Instead of just seeing this as authority and responsibility, this is a support mechanism to address and bridge these gaps. I would now like to offer the floor to Cristina, who can relate a little bit more about the development of these documents. Well, good. Thank you very much, Karina. And as we've already mentioned in all of the interventions, we can see that there's a whole compilation of literature. There there's a greater understanding as to why and how we can address women's led MSMEs and to exactly see the barriers and the financial services sector are just not providing enough. But as Maida indicated, we are providing data to understand who's receiving services, who isn't, and also looking at those financial institutions that have now been providing and are a part of the best practices. Now, looking at the literature, we didn't see anything specific about the role of the national development banks. And that's where we wanted to focus on that missing piece of the puzzle. And it conducts now an analysis as to what can national development banks do, taking into account these best practices, as Karina stated, that the unique role that national development banks play, what can they do? So looking at, we wanted to take one step further, because if we just remain in theory, we ask ourselves, how do we execute this? That's why we developed this second guide, cooperation mechanisms that Karina is going to discuss, the various steps that how we can actually implement this. So we're going to look at exactly what we found in our first report on best practices.
Como digo, es una recopilación de la literatura que hay, pero pensada específicamente en el rol que tienen los bancos nacionales de desarrollo, que como también ha dicho Mayra, es muy importante para canalizar, para movilizar todo el sistema financiero. Bien, en la siguiente vemos que está siempre pensado en esas dos funciones principales que suelen tener como entidades o bancos de primer piso, es decir, su conexión directa con las mujeres, y que también, como digo Mayra, con esos datos ha visto su rol tan importante para llegar a las mujeres y a sus empresas, pero también como entidades y bancos de segundo piso, a través de los intermediarios financieros, cómo puede canalizar, cómo pueden motivar a que se potencie el acceso a financiamiento a las mujeres, ¿no? Y a sus empresas. En este fomentar el financiamiento vemos ese segundo lado de la slide, en la que, como también lo ha mencionado Mayra, hay que entender el lado de la demanda y de la oferta. En el sentido de que por el lado de la demanda ya conocemos y sabemos que las mujeres y sus empresas, las empresarias, se autolimitan muchas veces, no acuden al sistema financiero por diferentes razones, y por lo tanto en ese papel por potenciar hay que entender eso y no decir, bueno, es que no hay demanda, no. ¿Qué está pasando para que esto sea así? Y poder actuar, ¿no? Y entonces en esas diferentes acciones y recomendaciones se incluyen, por ejemplo, el ofrecer servicios no financieros, entender cuáles son esas barreras e intentar mitigarlas, ¿no? El entender que a lo mejor las mujeres en ciertas zonas no se pueden acercar a la sucursal, ¿cómo me acerco yo a ellas? Y una vez que se acercan, una vez que entienden que ellas también son buenas clientas y son bienvenidas dentro de la entidad, que encuentren los productos que realmente son interesantes para ellos, ¿no? Y ahí es donde hay que adecuar la oferta, entender si mi oferta tal cual está, realmente está llegando y está cubriendo las necesidades y las posibilidades de las empresas de mujeres, porque como digo, sabemos, tiene una serie de barreras y de situaciones diferentes a la de las empresas de hombres. En ese actuar de bancos nacionales de desarrollo directamente con las empresarias como banco de primer
And then when we talked about the women, we also have to understand that these will be the banks, the second floor banks, because as Maida was saying, this is an example. What can we do? Of course, it makes sense to do this, to work and offer products and services for women-led businesses, not how do I do it? We just have to offer these products and to create the knowledge that Karina mentioned is very important, because women-led businesses is not a homogeneous group. And each national bank in the country has to understand the specific characteristics, because the economic and sociocultural contexts are different. The development banks have this very important role to create this knowledge and to share it with the rest of the financial system. Where are they? What sectors are they in? What are the differences between an enterprise which is in a rural enterprise, one instead that is an urban enterprise? So we have to try to reach all of them. And within that role, the national development banks and international banks have to make sure that they work with the regulators, and so that they would be the first step banks, so that there are changes in the products that are offered so that they are accessible, to understand if the system is friendly and is adequate for them. And if not, then they have to make the changes that are required. And as you can see, this is tied to this second stage row through the financial intermediaries, to be able to go down and say to them, very well, you can do this yourselves. How? Providing support, not only through guarantees and financing, as um, Karina is going to say, through the panelists as well. And as Maida was saying, through sharing data. As a development bank, I fix my goals. I see how many women are interested in this. How do they behave with my financial intermediaries? Of course, I'm going to provide them with the data that they need to understand how many women-led businesses are reached. Otherwise, I will teach you, and I will also explain how to do so digitally, online, creating a culture of change in the financial system to understand and provide the data that is required both from the supply as well as the demand sides. In the last few chapters of this report, what we will see is that we started writing this up during the pandemic, and then we asked ourselves, is this something that makes sense during a time of crisis, when everybody is in a state of crisis? The perspective, the gender perspective, is important. Well, the answer is yes, because we've seen, as Maida said, women-led businesses were the ones that were most affected by the pandemic, due to the sectors, due to the barriers that existed, and how new barriers and new problems were added to that. So the development banks started to create and offer a number of facilities to all of these entrepreneurs within the crisis situation. We asked ourselves, what are the ones that promote financing for women, digitalization, because there's less mobility, because they don't have as much time, but what other changes have to be taken into account so that the facility is there, truly is accessible, because we recognize and we take into account that this affects women more. In situations of crisis, women-led enterprises have to be taken into account so that they can access the assistance and services that exist. I also want to mention that for these interventions to take place, the gender perspective takes place in time. The DNA of the institution has to change from its policies to its structure to its culture, so that from inside, if we have already installed, we have already have a gender perspective in place, then we will be able to provide these services. And again, I'd like to mention what Juan was saying at the beginning. We don't have to do things on our own. We could do this through partnerships, and we have established a few partnerships that we can have with the development bank and other institutions, because we're part of the financial system. And so today we can promote financing for women-led businesses. Karina, now we would like to know how we could do all this. Thank you so much, Cristina. This second document that we are going to present is a step-by-step guide. It highlights a number of aspects that should be considered by the development banks. Let's go on to the next slide. These are topics that have to do with data compilations, but we would also like to comment a couple of these. Let's go on. And here we wanted to start by talking about what can be done by those windows from the development banks, those second stage windows. And that's where perhaps we can develop more instruments, and to make sure that there are instruments that take the gender perspective more into consideration, opening the appetite of the financial intermediaries. We have a few examples that are being implemented in the region, and in our panel, we will see a few of them. One of the first topics is financing through an amount or a percentage of the credit lines that the intermediaries provide in order to finance MSMEs, or designing programs that contemplate non-financial aspects that are for the use of financial intermediaries, especially in the context of Central America. This is something that is being done. A second topic is creating guarantee schemes. Perhaps this is seen as something which is a little more sophisticated, but it has been very useful in Central America. It has been piloted in order to sensitize the financial intermediaries based on the risk profiles of women-led businesses. They pay more punctually and as compared to men-led businesses. And then we have the gender bonds. In the region, there's only been a thematic bond issuance by FIDA in Mexico that issued a specific bond. And here again, we see a mobilization for specific destinations that are tied to the issuance. So there's a greater positioning in the market, a greater scalability of the government systems with reports on results and so on. And here I would also like to present this next slide because the more sophisticated and the more these products are publicized, we see that there might be a journey there might in the institutional transformation. I am showing this to you last, but it is really a key factor because if there is no conviction in the higher ups in the development banks, then it will be so much more complex to be able to fulfill these specific programs. And here we have to understand that the higher ups, the higher the people in power should take this into account. Every development bank should have at least a gender institutional policy that accompanies the policy that goes hand in hand with this, with specific roles, championing gender bias, and so on. So we know that there is very much information that is very valuable, which has been condensed in these documents, but we want to listen to the development banks. We want to listen to them talk about their experiences. And now we will go to the next part of the webinar. And I would like to invite Caridad Araujo, who is the head of gender and diversity at the IDB, who will moderate the panel, and especially the development banks, who are the protagonists of this panel. We were talking about them with these publications. But before that, I'd like to introduce Caridad, who is the chief of gender and diversity division in the IDB. She improves access to services, economic opportunities, strengthening the voice of women, indigenous peoples, people with discapacities, people with disabilities. It's truly a pleasure to have you with us, Caridad Araujo. Thank you so much for being with us on this panel. Thank you. Thank you so much, Karina. Can you hear me loud and clear? Yes, I can. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure for me to be here with you today. And above all, being with such a distinguished group of panelists to learn from their experiences in El Salvador, in Mexico, and Ecuador. If you will allow me, Karina, I would like to proceed to introduce the three people that are with me here today on this panel. I am going to start with Mary Valencia, who is the manager of the first stage business for the Banesal bank. She has had a number of posts in private banks as well as in the private bank. She is the manager of the commercial sector, and from 2022 she is the manager of the Bank of Development of El Salvador. We also have Roberto Romero. He is the president of the board of directors of the national corporations and of popular finances and solidarity finances. He has a very extensive experience in the financial sector, in public banks and telecommunications and health. Thank you so much, Roberto, for being with us today. And we also have Natalia Santoyo Rivera. Natalia is in the subdirection of projects from the Financial Nacional Financiera in Mexico. She was coordinator of advisors for the permanent representative of Mexico for the Organization for Cooperation and Economic Development. Thank you so much, Natalia, for being with us here today. Thank you so much to the three panelists for being with us today. And I'd like to start our conversation inviting all three of you to have a fluid dialogue with agile and brief answers. Let's start. Mary, Roberto, and Natalia. We'd like to know why your institutions have decided to design solutions that have been designed for women-led businesses. What are the innovations that your institutions have used? So, Mary, if you would kindly take the floor. Thank you so much for the invitation. As Bandesal, we're very grateful for this space. We'd like to tell you about the activities, the products and services for the development of women-led businesses. Through Bandesal in El Salvador, our government believes that women are a starting point for the growth of society. Within our country, we are committed to making our economy much more dynamic, providing services and products in order to go deeper into the access of financing to MSMEs and women-led businesses. Within the strategy that we have as an institution, we start from the development, advisement, and training from small projects to bigger investments. We provide three lines at this time with three main mechanisms of access to financing. And here we would like to point out access to direct credit to our first tier bank, where we start with the entrepreneur credit to the big companies. We have a second tier credit with 65 institutions that offer preferential conditions, especially for women-led businesses. We also have 14 lines of trust trust loans in which we can mention tourism, where we see that women participate, especially artisans, people, women that participate in this space. And so we've been able to finance their products and their projects as well. In El Salvador, everybody knows this, and this is a reality in Latin America. The participation of women in women-led businesses is much lower vis-a-vis men. So we're aware of this situation, and when we created the Council for Inclusion in the country, we're working hard in order to make sure that we abide by the national law on financial inclusion. We are creating specific products, some specific products that we could mention. For example, we have the Banca Mujer product that has given great results. Institutionally, we offer very special conditions, a methodology which is specific for microfinances, and coverage, guarantee coverage that could reach up to 70%, being aware of the fact that the accumulation of capital for women, especially in microfinancing sectors, is much more limited. In terms of our territory, we are opening our digital channels. We are trying to be online so that we can reach our women entrepreneurs more quickly so that they don't have to uh, show up physically, being there in presence, and being able to find the information that they need, the guidance through the digital media. We also have to thank the IDB for the support that it has given us and for advice, the advice that they have given us in order to promote financing to women. We can also talk about the credit line for the economic recovery for women entrepreneurs. We were able to provide funds, and thanks also to the advice and guidance that was given to us by the IDB in order to make sure that there's an overarching information for all of us. And we've also included sex, the gender information that is so important for women to be able to access credit. Thank you so much, Mary. Now we will listen all of the initiatives in the next round. I would like to give Roberto the floor at this point, so that he can talk about the importance of financing of women-led businesses. Hello, Caridad, and thank you so much for having me. I would like to send all of you a very warm greeting and thank you so much for this space. We've received quite a bit of support from the IDP. We're in a very important space with the financing and the space that you've given us to strengthen financial inclusion. The Corporation for Popular and Solidarity Finances is a public financing institution. We're a second tier bank, and our mission is basically that of strengthening what we call the popular and solidarity economy, which here in El Salvador, through our financial institutions, which are the credit unions, represent more than a third of the financial sector in our country. And in this sector and its partners, there's 80% of the work, the jobs offered in our country. This is very important for these corporations because behind all of the credit operations that are granted with a corporation, there has always to be a concept of financial inclusion. Within financial inclusion, we have other concepts that the population have access to products and services, financial services, that women and young people have access to productive credit, especially those productive credits for the MSMEs. And we also have in general a concept of financial inclusion in the real sense of the word. Of course, we strengthen the violet economy, and we also have economies that have to do with the green economy. We include a social inclusion in the rural and urban environments. And one of the strategies that we have incorporated in our corporation is something that was mentioned in the previous presentations. We have to know statistics and the data that is available. We have to know what the behavior of users of financial services is in a detailed fashion in all of the operations in the first tier. As a bank, as a second tier bank, we work with these institutions, we give them funds, second tier funds, so that these resources become productive micro credits of the first tier. We can collect this information, we can extrapolate all this with different databases that Ecuador has with the registrar, where all the social data is collected. We've been able to identify a number of opportunities in order to design our second tier products so that we can stimulate the inclusion and the financial inclusion and incorporation to the so-called violet economy with productive credits for women in particular. So today, thanks to the support from the multilateral banks, especially from the IDB, thanks for their funds, to their funds, we have achieved very positive results. Today, 52% of the operations that are granted with resources from the corporation are in the hands of women, particularly in the hands of women-led businesses. We've also seen that the younger these entrepreneur women are, more credits and amounts are being given to them or granted to them in the sector. As a second tier bank, what we try to do is to stimulate the financial institutions for them to have the tools that are needed to design the inclusion of women so that their presence is strengthened. We recognize their operations when they provide better rates and better terms in percentage. More credits are granted to women. We give them prizes so that they really have a financial inclusion. The result is that the financial indicators are spectacular. And I want to say that these programs have created a 0,05 delinquent basis. And it's spectacular, both here in Ecuador and in other countries, because the returns of companies that are managed by women are positive. And we see that there's a real growth, and we are visualizing all this with the breakdown of the information that we have, statistics and econometrics, and at a regional, local basis through different fields and dimensions that allow us to identify how they're making progress, how we're making progress with the stimuli that we are providing the market. And it has been said that we have a positive effect on our strategic allies that are the private credit cooperatives. And this way, we've been able to capitalize 75% of the market share, making sure that there is an important multiplicator effect. I would also like to tell you that the corporation created a product called the Fund for Guarantee. And this is in solidarity with the cooperatives that are led by women who, not having a collateral or guarantee to access credit, we became in those guarantors of those women who require a productive credit to improve their quality of life and their companies. This has been a very powerful tool for women, and it also benefited many women. Many millions of dollars have been injected in Ecuador to strengthen this guarantee fund. I'd also like to say that the IDB has capitalized this fund, obtaining very good results, and we see that financial inclusion is increasing. 52% of credit operations in Ecuador are in the hands of women with the resources that we provide them on the market. So thank you so much for giving me the floor. Thank you very much for your very interesting intervention. Now I would like to give the floor to Natalia so that she can describe Nafin's experience. How is it that Nafin has decided to focus this aspect of financing to women-led businesses? Natalia, thank you, Caridad. I would like to thank the invitation. Thank you for the invitation to be able to participate from Nafin, what we have been able to do. We start from the basis that no society can really develop in a sustainable manner if there is no distribution of opportunities and resources both for men and for women. And if there has been important progress in financing in entrepreneurs, women-led businesses, we also see a number of limiting factors. We have looked at the data from the World Bank. Women have 9% less probabilities of vis-a-vis men of having a financial account, a bank account, and this is reflected clearly in our region of Latin America. And 13 out of 100 establishments are women-led businesses that have obtained financing here in Mexico. Obviously, COVID opened this gap, widened this gap, but this also presents an opportunity to work in an economic recession that is an economic situation that is much more inclusive. We have been working on a wider, sustainable strategy taking into account the important gender factor. Development banks have a very important role in this sense in order to bridge this gap. We have been able to contribute to provide and increase the well-being and prosperity of both men and women. And obviously, the gender equality is a right, taking into account that this is a right within our society. So this is where our mandate is based, and this is where our sustainability strategy has been established. I don't want to provide too much detail because we will provide more detail later. But as a development bank, we work both at the first and second tier, also providing a guarantee scheme. I will talk about this a little further ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Now that we have you here, just tell us a little bit more about what kind of products have been developed by NAFIN that are focused on women. And if you could also discuss at the internal level exactly how NAFIN, in its strategies and policies, institutional strategies, how are they addressing gender equality within the organization? Well, thank you. As you mentioned, our strategy in terms of gender equity not only includes strengthening and developing our institutional culture, but also in our external relations. We're going to talk about some of the programs that we maintain currently, dating back to 2015 when we created the support for women entrepreneurs. This program was created jointly with the Secretariat of Finance and Public Credit. So the objective of the program was to be able to provide access to loan products according to the needs of women entrepreneurs, and at the same time recognize their credit worthiness. And the program operates on a basis of guarantees where, based on the resources provided, and we share risks with the financial intermediaries. Within the framework of the program, we have also eliminated some barriers, traditional barriers to financial services that women faced. For example, with solitary obligations, as well as mortgage loans, providing preferential interest rates. Within the framework of the program, there are two specific products. One that has to do with it's a program geared to MSMEs led by women, and we have one up to 600,000 pesos. The difference between the two programs is that the second program, this is for businesses that are just incorporating themselves into the tax structure. They're small businesses that are now in the formal sector, and it's an intermediate level between microcredit and a SME program. And more than 20 million loans, over 20 million pesos in value, have already been allocated. This is one of our star performing programs. And we're also, in terms of strengthening our institutional culture, we also are expanding to cover MSMEs and working for example, the climate loan program. In July 2021, we provided conditional loans, and we were able to work with the first National Development Bank in Mexico to support this. Ultimately, I think the results speak for themselves. And within the gaps that we're trying to cover to provide a complete accreditation, this again relating to gender entrepreneurs, we are looking at gender policies established, which includes guidelines for increasing women's participation in financial services, strengthening gender equality in institutions. We've worked together with international organizations that include the IDB, with technical cooperation mechanisms in paving the way for new gender policies. In fact, we're just about at the final stage of the development of these guidelines, and we're about to publish them. Working together with that policy, we also have gender institutional measures that were established via the gender policy, and also providing now disaggregated data, disaggregated by gender, working with the IDB. And I think that was already discussed in some of the other presentations. It's very important to have disaggregated data so that we get a better picture of the role and level of participation of women in the area of financial services for businesses. So we need to identify, and that allows us to focus on our priorities for second tier banking services. We also have other activities in the area of human resources development. We have training programs. We have the protocol for protecting women from sexual harassment in the workplace, working on best practices, gender equality, as well as measures against discrimination, gender discrimination. We also actively participate in various working groups and international organizations, specific gender related focus areas, including the Montreal Group. We are active participants in the most recent gender initiatives. And now to wrap it up, working with priorities and strategies with the federal government, and we actively contribute to the commitments made by Mexico at the international level in order to achieve the objective 5 of the SDGs. And any questions that you have, we're more than happy to answer. Thank you very much, Natalia. Very complete response. Now, maybe Mary could talk a little bit about some of the new gender policies in terms of bank products as well at Bandesal, at the internal level. What actions, what are some of the transformative measures in the organization are being proposed with these new policies? Thank you. Well, we already have various measures. We have the National Council of Financial Inclusion for Women, where we facilitate access through financial mechanisms, developing these focus areas to empower women-led MSMEs to provide new job opportunities. All of that is part of our support for the MSMEs. Through these national working groups, starting in 2001, the policies for financial inclusion, where we continue to become actively engaged, Bandesal and other stakeholders, providing stakeholders that will pave the way for access. Bandesal has reinforced our installed capacity to train, advise, and provide technical assistance in developing business models, identifying the levels of success. So through the digital and empowering entrepreneurs, developing digital skills, business practices, standardization of a matrix that will allow us to measure success levels. By doing all of this, we are paving the way for new assistance measures, working with our strategic partners, first tier as well as second tier institutions that will launch new business ventures that will be highly successful. In fact, we already have a very moving track record in how we were able to, through these businesses, generate more jobs and, as a result, greater benefits to our societies. So we continue to focus on these 4 pillars: the creation of new products, mainly our flagship product at Bandes, that are geared mainly to women, digitalization and financial innovation. We're about to launch our new app at Bandesal, where we will provide loans, credits, financial education, that all of that is a part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Also, to spread the word and raise greater awareness about MSMEs, providing technical advice And at the same time, we focus on empower their growth so that they can take the next steps. Now, in terms of empowering the consumer, who can become more aware of their rights and also the scaling up of financing for their businesses, we as members of the National Council are continuously creating a new institutional policy or set of policies strengthening gender equity, developing both internal and external policies. So this is an effort that is ongoing and it continues to evolve. But at Bandesal, we're very clear as to what our mandate and our objective is, which is to support the educational and health well-being and financial well-being at all of the sectors that we work with. Thank you very much, Mary. And now to conclude the second part of our Q&A, I'd like to ask Roberto to also just discuss what are some of the internal changes have been undertaken by CONA FIPS, or what do you envision to promote gender equality within the organization? Maybe you could also just discuss a little bit more, maybe elaborate on the use of disaggregated data, what you've been doing in order to better get a better analysis of your products and who they're reaching. Maybe you can just share some of that or expand on some of the experiences you already shared. Thank you very much, Caridad. Sorry, I didn't activate the mic. Well, in the corporation, we have been very aware of the need to strengthening the purple economy. And 56% of staff that work at the corporation are women. And in our upper level executive positions, 52% of our managers are women. So it's interesting to note that we've been able to design specifically tailored products for various market niches. For example, the data that we have processed within the corporation allowed us to identify the fact that one of the largest gaps seen in each and every productive and industrial sector and in regions throughout the country, we looked at the gaps in terms of the amounts of loans that women receive for any business or for their SMEs, MSMEs. So as a second tier bank, as we provide them second tier loans to 350 financial institutions that work with us, these funds already have market competitive advantages that allow first tier loan operations that are much more competitive in terms of terms, rates, and amounts. But we want to go even beyond that. What did we do, especially with productive microcredits, one of our star products? For example, of the 100% of the second tier funds that we provide, 60% of those funds are up to $100,000, and there is also a reward in terms of rates, so that the cooperative can transfer that to the partners. But we don't just leave it there. We actually implement an additional benefit when the loans reach up to about $10,000 that were granted to women. We provide reward in terms of the reduction of the first tier bank. So that gap in terms of amounts, rates, and terms can be reduced and can be much more inclusive of women. This profile with regards to these funds have allowed that the number of operations for women are stimulated, they grow faster, and they contribute to shrinking the gap and contribute to their incorporation into the financial sector. This is just, we could get into much more specific detail as to how each market niche and segment has responded, but that would take a long time. We can provide all that information, of course. Thank you very much, Roberto. Very interesting. We have a few questions that have been submitted from our audience through the Q&A section. So I'm going to ask the first question, and I invite any one of our panelists that would like to intervene to answer. So the first question I think is fairly interesting, and it has to do, how do you address the disaggregated data by sex at the level of the financial intermediaries, given that they don't have direct access to the businesses? So I would like to hear your experiences in that regard, how you addressed this particular situation. Roberto, we saw your hand raised first, so go ahead. Thank you very much. Well, we have a very close relationship with the financial institutions we're working with. And within the agreements and contracts signed to provide second-tier loan operations, one of the requirements that we established in the agreements is that there has to be a feedback of information of the person that has received the loans or granted the loans with our resources. So we have a matrix with various fields and dimensions that have to be filled in by the financial institution that receives the second-tier loans. And that information must be reported to the corporation on an ongoing basis. This information is then extrapolated in order to measure the quality of the data. We need to have an accurate quality that will help us to make good decisions. And we extrapolate that with the information that the government of Ecuador provides. We know, for example, that the loan was granted to a woman with a certain ID card, and then we extrapolate that with other identification information to make sure that it's all consistent. So we conduct a cross-referencing of information. We know exactly in what sector the loan was granted, who provided it, in what province this was located, what city. It's a whole field of information that we compile so that we can develop that social profile and balance. Well, before I ask Mary and Natalia, talking about that cross-referencing of data, we're using, for example, national ID cards and marriage certificates. Do you also do any cross-referencing of information with, for example, chambers of commerce or business association information? Because there you can have a good idea as to a lot of data, including the makeup of their board of directors of these companies, to make sure that these businesses are led by women. I think that's a complex issue, but Natalia or Mary, if you would like to answer. And before we move on, and before I offer the floor to Roberto, would you like to add anything more to that, to those comments? Natalia, I see that you did raise your hand, so go ahead. Go ahead. Well, I didn't see my hand, but anyway. Well, my comment has to do with what you were saying about the complexities to be able to define if a business is run by or owned by women. And we also have that close cooperation with the financial intermediaries. And we do use ID cards, but I think part of the efforts part of the awareness raising efforts with the banking sector is to highlight the need to have that information, simple data, and what kind of impact that we're trying to generate with this and to have. I believe that part of the regulatory process needs to emphasize the gathering of this kind of information, the relevance of this information, working with the regulators to establish standards and procedures for reporting this type of information would definitely support and a favorable result. Thank you, Natalia. Mary, go ahead. Well, just to add a little bit to what my colleagues said, we need to have specific data related not just to the sector, but also the size and the final end use of these loan products, capturing information from all of the institutions that provide second-tier loans and trust information relating to first-tier banking information so that we can develop products and adapt the existing products to support these strategic end states. We just developed a major amendment, a change in our agricultural policy. And for El Salvador, it's highly relevant in not just the social context, but also environmentally, where we are pleased to see that the National Council of Coffee Growers, women in the coffee growing industry in particular, to get a better understanding about the needs and the growth needed in this market, we basically introduced changes that would benefit the growth of this niche. That's why access to the information that you just mentioned is crucial. And I'm taking with me some of the best practices that our colleague just mentioned. Well, just to conclude this aspect of cross-referencing and how important it is. Yes, you have to develop platforms, data warehouse, smart business and mega data management. There are many organizations that compile information. The corporation is able to connect to data and key databases in order to be able to populate and provide greater value, greater insight and visibility to our analyses with this information. And just to respond to your question, Caridad, in addition to cross-referencing data with, for example, with certificates, marriage certificates, all these vital statistics and ID cards, we also have access to many databases that provide highly valuable information for our decision-making process, and the need to retain data that is as accurate and timely as possible. That's crucial. Any implementation, any provision of goods and services that we have are going to have major impacts in the market. And we need to identify that on a timely basis to make sure that, and through trial and error, how is the market responding? And are we actually seeing meaningful levels of financial inclusion? In this case, the purple economy. So it's by trial and error that we've been adapting our products in order to ensure a successful level of financial inclusion, which we feel we have in terms of including women for access to financial services. Thank you, Roberto. Let's move on to the next question that has to do with the potential of fintechs, specifically to address some of the obstacles associated with financial exclusion. I don't know if anybody here would like to share their experiences with the fintech. Not necessarily. That's fine. Roberto. Well, fintech in Ecuador is still at a very fledgling state. We still don't have a clear and robust structure for fintech, but look, when we look at open banking, the corporation has already taken a few steps towards open banking so that people in the solidarity economy can have access to a platform that the corporation has designed so that regardless of the financial institution that could provide loans and savings products and services can be addressed. So we have a database that is shared at the national level with all of the financial institutions in terms of the popular economy. For people that need services. These financial entities can get in touch with them so that they can provide their services and products in an open manner, in a democratic manner. So someone that needs specific financial products will receive calls from more than one financial institution in order to cover their needs. We're taking small steps, although they're significant in Ecuador in the context of open banking. We have Cisco, the contact system. This is the first major experiment that has already been in operation for the last couple of years. Thank you. One of the other questions that came up on the chat has to do with risk assessment, especially when people don't have financial track record or history. I see, Mary, you raised your hand. How do you address that? Thank you. Thank you. Well, we in Bandesal, we have developed and evolved a credit methodology that can be read accurately by all of the sectors working in women's women entrepreneurs. And we have specialized teams that that conduct field mapping. And we also have matrices that will allow that transition from the quantitative to the qualitative and closer cooperation in terms of risk assessments, looking at the profiles and the conditions associated with each profile. And we've had enormous levels of penetration since the matrix has been in operation in El Salvador with Bandesal in supporting economic development. Thank you. I don't know, Natalia or Roberto, would you like to add anything to that? No, just to add that this is part of we have envisioned in our action plan, institutional level plan that encompasses these areas for this year. And we're going to be implementing this, and hopefully by the next time we meet, the next webinar, we'll be able to provide you with some follow-up information. Yeah, it's very important to be able to hear from each one of you, especially when you're reaching that point where you've begun to implement a new measure, and especially in such a cross-cutting way. This is a key aspect of how the sector can promote gender equality through businesses. Well, we're just about reaching the end of our discussion. So I'm going to offer the floor to Karina for a few final words. I'd like to thank Mary, Roberto, Natalia for joining us in this discussion. We have learned a great deal from your efforts, and we're very pleased to see that it's a sector that is evolving very quickly, where you're learning from and developing new solutions that are so necessary to bridge those gaps in access to financial services, especially for women-led MSMEs. So please continue the good work. And Karina, go ahead. Well, thank you, Caridad, and I'd like to thank all of our panelists who were with us this morning. And of course, I'd like to thank those who have participated with us very actively, asking questions in the chat, and who have joined us for this event. Your opinions are very important to us. It's always crucial to have your feedback that we can use to make improvements. So we've just sent you a quick survey, and if you could just, you can scan the QR code, or you can just, and let us know your impressions, both in Spanish or in English. So with that, we have concluded our webinar on behalf of the Inter-American Development Bank. Would like to once again thank you for being with us, and hopefully that the information that was shared today will be very useful to you. Thank you.